Bumpy Johnson placed the bag on the table. He looked at Frank Lucas and said, "Take it and go." But everyone in the room knew, the man who took that bag would never come back. Harlem, 1968. The back room of Small's Paradise on 7th Avenue. 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night. 10 men stood along the walls, watching. None of them spoke. None of them moved. Bumpy Johnson sat at the head of a scarred wooden table, his fedora tilted slightly back, his dark suit immaculate despite the August heat. At 70 years old, he looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from building an empire and knowing you won't live to see it completed. Frank Lucas stood across from him. 38 years old. Sharp suit. No jewelry. No flash. Invisible the way Bumpy had taught him to be. Between them sat a leather bag. Worn. Heavy. Filled with $50,000 in small bills. Bumpy's hand rested beside the bag. Not on it. Beside it. The difference mattered. "Nicky Barnes says you've been holding back," Bumpy said quietly. His voice carried despite its softness. "Says you've been skimming? Says you think you're ready to run your own operation?" Frank didn't respond. He knew better than to defend himself before understanding the accusation. Bumpy continued. "This bag contains what you would have made if you'd been honest with me for the past 3 years. Call it back pay. Call it severance. Call it whatever you want." He pushed the bag forward 6 inches. "Take it. Walk out that door. Start your own thing. No hard feelings." The room held its breath. Frank looked at the bag. Then at Bumpy. Then at the bag again. He didn't reach for it. Frank didn't argue. He didn't explain. He waited. To understand what happened in that room, you need to understand how Frank Lucas got there. 1946. Frank was 16 years old, standing in a North Carolina tobacco field, watching his cousin get beaten to death by the Ku Klux Klan for looking at a white woman the wrong way. The sheriff stood by and watched. Did nothing. Frank learned something that day that would define his life. The law protected power, not justice. He left North Carolina the next morning with $6 in his pocket and murder in his heart. Harlem took him in. Fed him. Taught him. He ran numbers. He drove cars. He kept his mouth shut and his eyes open. He learned that in the criminal world, visibility was death. The flashy guys always got caught. The quiet ones built empires. 1952. Frank met Bumpy Johnson outside a barber shop on 135th Street. Bumpy was 44 then, already a legend. Frank was 22 and nobody. "You're the Carolina boy," Bumpy said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "You've been working for Junie. He says you're smart. Says you don't talk. That true?" "Yes, sir." Bumpy studied him for a long moment. "Smart and quiet will take you further than loud and stupid. Remember that." Frank became Bumpy's driver. Then his collector. Then his enforcer, though Frank never used violence unless absolutely necessary. Bumpy taught him something more valuable than fear, strategy. "Power," Bumpy said one night in 1965, "isn't about being the strongest. It's about being the one nobody sees coming." For 16 years, Frank learned. He learned how to move money without drawing attention. He learned how to build networks without creating enemies. He learned that loyalty wasn't about love, it was about mutual interest maintained through consistent behavior. By 1968, Frank was Bumpy's most trusted lieutenant. He ran collections across 3 neighborhoods. He moved heroin from Bumpy's suppliers to Bumpy's dealers without a single arrest, a single robbery, a single problem. Which is why Nicky Barnes hated him. Nicky Barnes was everything Frank wasn't. Loud. Flashy. Visible. He wore fur coats and drove Cadillacs and made sure everyone knew he was a player. Nicky wanted to be famous. Frank wanted to be rich. Nicky had been whispering in Bumpy's ear for months. Planting seeds? Suggesting Frank was getting too big. too independent, too dangerous. And now, in this back room on this August night, Bumpy was offering Frank a choice. Take the money and leave. Prove Nicky right. Prove you were always planning to betray me. Or refuse the money. Stay invisible. Prove your loyalty is worth more than $50,000. The test wasn't about the money. It was about who Frank Lucas wanted to be. Frank stood completely still. His hands at his sides. His face revealing nothing. He looked at Bumpy Johnson, the man who had taught him everything, the father figure who had given a North Carolina farm boy a chance at something more than poverty and rage. I don't want your money, Frank said quietly. I want your respect. The room exhaled. Bumpy's face didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Why? Because money runs out. Respect builds empires. Bumpy leaned back in his chair. A small smile touched his lips. Nicky said you'd take the bag? Said you were ready to go solo? Said you were tired of working for an old man? Nicky's wrong. Is he? Bumpy's voice hardened slightly. You think I don't know you've been making connections? You think I don't know about your meetings with the suppliers? You think I don't know you've been planning something? Frank met his gaze steadily. I've been planning to take over when you're gone. Because you're dying, and someone needs to keep this organization running. But I'm not taking anything while you're still here. That's not how you taught me. Silence filled the room like smoke. Bumpy studied Frank for what felt like an eternity. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table beside the money bag. This is the contact information for my heroin supplier in Thailand. His name is Leslie Atkinson. He's a sergeant in the U.S. military. He ships pure heroin inside the coffins of dead soldiers coming back from Vietnam. Bumpy tapped the paper. No one knows about this except me and him. The Italian families don't know. The police don't know. Nicky doesn't know. Frank didn't move. I'm giving this to you. Bumpy continued. Not because you refused the money. Because you understood why I offered it. He stood slowly, his age showing in the careful movement. The money was never the test, Frank. The test was whether you understood that loyalty without strategy is just servitude. You could have taken that bag and I would have respected you for it. But you saw past the obvious choice to the real one. Bumpy walked around the table until he stood beside Frank. Nicky Barnes will never understand that. He thinks power is about being seen, being feared, being known. That's why he'll be in prison within 5 years. He placed his hand on Frank's shoulder. But you'll outlast all of them. Because you understand the most important rule. Stay invisible, Frank said quietly. Stay invisible, Bumpy confirmed. Subscribe and leave a comment. Because the most important part of this story is still ahead. Bumpy Johnson died 7 months later. Heart attack. February 1969. Frank Lucas was at his bedside. The game is yours now, Bumpy whispered, his breath shallow. Remember what I taught you. Don't be flashy like Nicky. Don't trust the Italians. Go straight to the source. Cut out the middlemen. And never, ever let them see you coming. Frank nodded. I won't let you down. I know. Bumpy's eyes closed. Because you understood what that bag meant. You understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away from money. Those were the last words Bumpy Johnson ever spoke. The funeral was massive. Every criminal in New York attended. The Italian families sent representatives. The police watched from across the street. Nicky Barnes wore a white fur coat and made sure the cameras caught him. Frank Lucas wore a simple black suit and stood in the back. After the funeral, Frank made his move. He used Bumpy's Thailand connection. He went straight to Leslie Atkinson. He cut out every middleman between the poppy fields and Harlem streets. He imported heroin so pure it made everything else on the market look like baby powder. He called it blue magic. He became the richest criminal in New York City. Richer than the Italian families. Richer than Nicky Barnes. Richer than anyone realized because nobody knew who he was. Frank Lucas followed Bumpy's rules. He didn't wear fur coats. He didn't drive Cadillacs. He didn't go to clubs. He stayed invisible. He dressed like a middle-class businessman. He paid his taxes. He looked like nobody. And for years, it worked perfectly. The Italian families couldn't figure out where the pure heroin was coming from. The police had no idea who was running the Harlem drug trade. Nicky Barnes got all the attention, and eventually all the arrests, while Frank operated in plain sight, completely unseen. 1975. Frank Lucas was worth $52 million. He owned apartment buildings, car washes, nightclubs. He had money hidden in banks across 3 countries. And nobody knew his name. One night, sitting in his modest home in Teaneck, New Jersey, Frank opened his safe and pulled out an old leather bag. The same bag Bumpy had pushed across the table 7 years earlier. Frank had kept it all this time, empty, as a reminder. He thought about that night. About the choice. About the 10 men watching from the walls, expecting him to take the money and prove Nicky right. About Bumpy's test. The money would have been $50,000. Spent and gone within a year. The respect, and the Thailand connection that came with it, had been worth $52 million. But what happened next was the moment everyone would remember. 1976. Frank Lucas made one mistake. One moment of visibility. He went to the Muhammad Ali vs. Joe Frazier fight at Madison Square Garden. His wife convinced him. "Just this once," she said. "You've earned it." He wore a chinchilla coat. Sat ringside. One night of visibility after 8 years of being invisible. Detective Richie Roberts saw him. Noticed the coat. Started asking questions. "Who is that guy? Why haven't I heard of him?" Within 6 months, the entire operation unraveled. Frank Lucas was arrested in January 1975. The police found weapons, drugs, and enough evidence to put him away for 70 years. The invisible man had finally been seen. In prison, Frank thought about that night in Small's paradise. About Bumpy's test. About the leather bag on the table. He'd passed Bumpy's test. He'd stayed invisible for years. He'd built an empire exactly the way Bumpy taught him. But he'd forgotten the most important lesson at the worst possible moment. Visibility is death. One coat. One fight. One night of wanting to be seen. That's all it took. Share and subscribe. This is how legends are remembered. Frank Lucas served 15 years. He got out in 1991. He was 61 years old and broke. The empire was gone. The money was gone. The power was gone. But the lesson remained. Years later, in an interview, someone asked Frank about the night Bumpy tested him with the bag of money. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd taken it?" Frank smiled. "I know exactly what would have happened. I would have been dead within a week. That wasn't a gift. It was a loaded gun on a table. Bumpy was asking, 'Are you smart enough not to shoot yourself?' And you were." "For a while," Frank admitted. "But I forgot. I got proud. I wanted to be seen just once. And that one time destroyed everything." He paused, looking out the window of the small apartment where he lived on a modest pension. Bumpy's test wasn't just about that night. It was about every night after. Every choice. Every temptation. Stay invisible. That was the test. And I passed it for 8 years. But the test never ends. And the moment you forget that. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The leather bag sits in Frank's apartment today. Empty. A reminder of the night he proved his loyalty and the years he remembered the lesson. And the one night he forgot. In Harlem, old men still tell stories about Bumpy Johnson's test. About the bag on the table. About Frank Lucas standing there, not taking the money, choosing respect over cash. That, they say, is when Frank became Frank. But they always add the second part. And the Muhammad Ali fight is when he stopped being invisible. Frank Lucas learned the most important lesson twice. Once from Bumpy Johnson in a back room in 1968. Once from a detective named Richie Roberts in a courtroom in 1976. The first lesson built an empire. The second lesson destroyed it. Share and subscribe. This is how legends are remembered. Today, the leather bag sits in a museum. Empty. A symbol of the test that defined a generation of Harlem's underworld. The test that separated the flashy from the strategic. The loud from the invisible. Bumpy Johnson taught Frank Lucas that loyalty without strategy is servitude. But Frank taught himself the harder lesson: invisibility without discipline is just delay. The money runs out. The empires fall. But the test never ends. Stay invisible. Or be forgotten.